December 10th, 1967, 3:28 in the afternoon. A Beechcraft H-18 descends through thick fog over Lake Monona, Wisconsin. Inside 26-year-old Otis Redding, the king of soul, 4 members of his band the Bar-Kays, and their pilot. Minutes later, the plane crashes into icy water. All but one will die. 3 days earlier, Otis had recorded a song, a quiet, contemplative song about sitting on a dock, watching time pass, watching ships roll in. He whistled at the end because he couldn't think of lyrics. The song was unfinished. He planned to complete it after this tour. He never got the chance. So how does a song about wasting time become a dead man's biggest hit? What was the King of Soul doing on a tiny plane in winter fog? And why does fate feel written into every note he recorded that week? The truth involves a grueling tour schedule, an unfinished masterpiece, and a lake that wouldn't give him back. Let me know where you're watching this from in the comments. Grab yourself a warm drink, maybe a cup of water or tea. Sit back, and let's start this journey together. The letter arrived at Stax Records in Memphis, Tennessee, in October 1962. Phil Walden, a young promoter from Macon, Georgia, had a client. A singer, 21 years old, voice like a hurricane trapped in a church. His name was Otis Redding, Jim Stewart, who ran Stax with his sister Estelle Axton. Listened to the demo, then he listened again. These Arms of Mine wasn't like the other records flooding his desk. It was raw, vulnerable. Otis sang like a man begging. And you believed every word. Stewart signed him to the Volt subsidiary immediately. The song climbed to number 20 on the R&B charts in early 1963. Not massive, but enough. Enough to prove that Otis Redding wasn't just another singer from Georgia. He was something else entirely. What followed was a blur of recording sessions, tour buses, and stages that got bigger every month. Stax paired Otis with Booker T and the MGs, the house band that had become the heartbeat of Memphis soul. Steve Cropper on guitar, Donald Duck Dunn on bass, Al Jackson Jr. on drums, Booker T. Jones on organ. They were white and black, playing together in a segregated city, creating a sound that didn't care about any of that. Pain in My Heart in 1964, Mr. Pitiful in 1965. I've Been Loving You Too Long, that same year. Each song a masterclass in controlled devastation. Otis didn't just sing lyrics, he lived inside them, screamed them, bled them across 3 minutes of vinyl. The tours became relentless. The Chitlin Circuit across the South, the Apollo Theater in Harlem, where audiences didn't forgive and didn't forget. Otis conquered it. Then Europe, where crowds treated American soul singers like royalty. In London and Paris, Otis Redding wasn't just a star, he was a revelation. But success at Stax came with a price. The label operated on razor-thin margins. Studio time cost money they didn't always have. Distribution deals changed. Otis recorded constantly, sometimes cutting 3 or 4 songs in a single session, because you never knew when the money would dry up. Atlantic Records, Stax's distributor, controlled more than anyone at the Memphis label wanted to admit. Back home in Macon, Zelma Redding raised their growing family largely alone. Otis was gone 200 days a year, 300 some years, phone calls from hotel rooms, postcards from cities she'd never seen. He sent money, he sent love. But he couldn't send himself. The music kept coming anyway. Respect in 1965, a song Otis wrote and recorded with swagger and demand. Aretha Franklin would later flip it, make it a feminist anthem, make it bigger than Otis's version ever got. He didn't mind. Good songs lived multiple lives. Then came 1967, the year everything crystallized. June 17, 1967, the Monterey International Pop Festival in California. Otis Redding, the soul singer from Macon, stepped onto a stage in front of a crowd that had come for Jimi Hendrix and Janis Joplin and the sounds of psychedelic rock. They didn't know Otis. Most of them had never heard of Stax Records. He opened with Shake, then Respect, then I've Been Loving You Too Long. And somewhere in the middle of that song, the crowd stopped being polite. They lost their minds. Otis commanded that stage like a man who owned every atom of air in the venue. He dropped to his knees. He pleaded. He roared. When he finished with Try a Little Tenderness, building it from a whisper to an explosion, the predominantly white audience gave him a standing ovation that seemed like it might never end. Rock critics who dismissed soul music as simple suddenly understood. This wasn't simple. This was architecture, emotional physics. Otis Redding had just kicked down a door between genres, between audiences, between what people thought was possible. The performance was filmed, broadcast. Otis became a crossover star overnight. Record sales jumped, concert offers poured in. He'd proven he could play anywhere, for anyone, and leave them shattered. But Monterey was in June. By November, Otis was exhausted. The tour schedule hadn't slowed, if anything. Success meant more demands, more cities, more stages, more time away from Macon. Stax needed hits, promoters needed shows, fans needed Otis Redding, and Otis Redding needed to deliver. Still, something had shifted. In a houseboat in Sausalito, California, Otis sat and watched the San Francisco Bay, watched the water, watched the ships, watched time move differently than it did on tour buses and in recording studios. He felt something quiet, something new. He had an idea for a song. By late November 1967, Otis was back in Memphis, back at Stax, back with Steve Cropper and the MGs, one more session before the December tour. One more song to cut. The song was different, softer, a man sitting still, for once, just watching the world roll by. November 1967, Stax Studio A, Memphis, Tennessee. Otis Redding sat down with Steve Cropper and played him something he'd been working on. A melody, some lyrics scribbled on paper, the opening line, "Sittin' in the morning sun, I'll be sittin' when the evening comes." Cropper, who'd co-written some of Otis's biggest hits, listened. This wasn't the Otis Redding sound. No explosive vocals, no screaming, no begging. This was contemplative, quiet. A man sitting on a dock in San Francisco, watching ships, watching time, doing absolutely nothing. "It's different," Cropper said later in interviews. Different was an understatement. Everything about the song broke from the formula that had made Otis a star. The inspiration had come from Sausalito, from those moments watching the bay. But the song had deeper roots. Otis was tired, genuinely tired, the kind of exhaustion that sleep doesn't fix. He'd been touring non-stop since 1962. 5 years of buses and planes and stages and hotel rooms that all looked identical. 5 years of being away from Zelma and the kids. 5 years of giving everything to audiences and having just enough left over to get to the next city. The song was about rest, about stopping, about a man who'd left Georgia, who'd traveled 2,000 miles and still couldn't find whatever he was looking for, over several sessions in late November and early December. They built the track. The MGs laid down the rhythm, relaxed and swaying, almost lazy. Cropper added guitar lines that shimmered like light on water. Otis sang it gently, not pushing, just letting the words sit in the air. "Looks like nothing's going to change. Everything still remains the same." Then came the whistle. Otis couldn't figure out the final lyrics. The verse felt incomplete, so he whistled, just whistled the melody. Cropper suggested they keep it, leave it in, let the whistle be the ending. "I'm just going to whistle it for now," Otis reportedly said, "and we'll come back and fix it later." They recorded multiple takes, tried different arrangements. The song kept wanting to be quiet, reflective. Otis's vocal was restrained, almost resigned. This was a man sitting still, watching the world move without him, and accepting it. But it wasn't finished. The mix needed work. Otis wanted to add more vocals, maybe rethink that whistling section, polish the edges. He and Cropper agreed they'd finish it after the December tour. Otis had shows booked: Cleveland on December 9th, Madison, Wisconsin on December 10th, Nashville, and more dates after that. The song could wait a few weeks. Before he left Memphis, Otis played the rough mix for some people at Stax. Reactions were mixed, according to later accounts. Some loved it. Others weren't sure. It was so different from "Try a Little Tenderness," from Respect, from everything that had made Otis Redding a star. Would radio play it? Would fans understand Otis didn't seem worried? He believed in the song, believed it was something new, something that could expand what soul music could be. He'd proven at Monterey that he could surprise people. This would be another surprise. "We'll finish it when I get back from the tour," he told Cropper. The tour was short, just a few shows. 2 weeks, maybe 3. Then he'd be back in Memphis, back in the studio, and they'd complete what they'd started. Add the final touches, make it perfect. On December 7th, 1967, Otis Redding left Memphis. The multi-track tapes of Sittin' on the Dock of the Bay stayed behind, locked in the Stax vault, unfinished, unmixed, incomplete. The song sat there, waiting. A song about a man sitting on a dock, wasting time, watching ships roll away. A song about going nowhere and being fine with it. 3 days later, Otis would board a small plane in Cleveland. The weather would be terrible. The destination was Madison, Wisconsin, just another city on just another tour. The song would still be waiting in Memphis when the plane took off, but the plane would never make it. And the song would never get finished the way Otis Redding planned. December 1967. The tour schedule was modest by Otis Redding standards, a handful of Midwest shows, nothing grueling. Cleveland, Ohio on December 9th, Madison, Wisconsin on December 10th, then south to Nashville and a few more dates before Christmas. Otis traveled with his touring band, the Bar K's, young men, most of them teenagers. Matthew Kelly, 18, on drums, Ronnie Caldwell, 19, on keyboards, Phelan Jones, 18, on saxophone, Carl Cunningham, 18, on drums, James Alexander on bass stayed behind in Cleveland. Jimmy King on guitar wasn't on this leg of the tour. Ben Cawley, 20, played trumpet. They were kids, really. Talented kids who'd gotten the gig of a lifetime backing the king of soul. December 9th, Leo's Casino in Cleveland. The show went well, according to later accounts. Otis performed. The crowd responded. Another successful night. After the show, plans were made for the next day's travel. Madison was roughly 425 miles west. They'd fly in the morning. The plane was a Beechcraft H-18. Twin engine. Small. The kind of aircraft musicians used constantly because it was cheaper than commercial flights and faster than driving. Otis had flown in planes like this dozens of times. The pilot was Richard Fraser, experienced with the aircraft. The flight plan was straightforward. Cleveland to Madison's Truax Field Airport. December 10th dawned cold. Weather reports for the Great Lakes region showed deteriorating conditions. Fog, poor visibility. Winter was settling in hard. They took off from Cleveland that morning. Otis, Fraser, and 4 Bar K's members, Cawley, Kelly, Caldwell, Jones, and Cunningham, Matthew Kelly's younger brother, also on board. 7 people total. The flight was routine for most of the journey, no reported problems. Fraser maintained contact with air traffic control as they crossed into Wisconsin airspace. By early afternoon, they were approaching Madison. The Factory nightclub was expecting Otis Redding that evening. Posters had been up for weeks. Tickets sold. Another show. Another audience waiting. At 3:28 p.m., the Beechcraft H-18 began its descent toward Truax Field, 4 miles from Lake Monona. The fog was thick. Visibility was minimal. And then everything went wrong. 3:28 p.m., the Beechcraft H-18 was 4 miles from Truax Field when it went down. Witnesses on the ground near Lake Monona reported hearing the engine sputtering, the sound of a plane in distress. Then the sound stopped. Then impact. The aircraft plunged into the frigid waters of Lake Monona, just outside Madison. The lake was 83 feet deep at the crash site. The water temperature hovered just above freezing. December in Wisconsin doesn't forgive, according to the National Transportation Safety Board investigation that followed. The plane experienced engine failure on approach. The exact cause would be debated, analyzed, documented in reports. Mechanical failure, ice on the wings, poor visibility compounding every factor. The plane descended too fast, lost altitude, and couldn't recover. It hit the water hard. Ben Cawley, 20 years old, was asleep when the plane went down. He woke to impact, to freezing water rushing in, to chaos and darkness and the fuselage breaking apart around him. In interviews years later, Cawley described holding his breath, being thrown from the wreckage, surfacing in water so cold it felt like knives. He was still strapped to his seat. The seat cushion kept him afloat. He screamed for the others, called their names into the fog. Matthew, Ronnie, Phelan, Carl, Otis, the pilot. He heard nothing back, just water, just his own voice disappearing into December air. Cawley clung to that seat cushion. Hypothermia was already setting in. He couldn't feel his hands, couldn't feel his feet. The cold was eating through him, shutting down his body piece by piece. He would later say he didn't know how long he was in that water. Minutes felt like hours. A local man, James O'Brien, was nearby when the plane went down. He saw it happen. He rushed to the lake, found a boat, and pushed out into the water. through the fog. He found Ben Cawley barely conscious, still floating, still breathing. O'Brien pulled him from the lake. One survivor, just one. Emergency crews arrived within minutes. Rescue boats scoured the crash site. Divers went down into the murky, freezing water. They found the wreckage scattered across the lake floor. They found bodies. Otis Redding was pulled from the water that evening. 26 years old, the king of soul, dead on impact, according to medical examiners. Pilot Richard Fraser, dead. Matthew Kelly, 18, dead. Ronnie Caldwell, 19, dead. Phelan Jones, 18, dead. Carl Cunningham, 18, dead. Matthew Kelly's younger brother, dead. 7 people on the plane, 6 dead. One survivor who would spend the rest of his life asking why. The news broke that night, December 10th, 1967. Radio stations across the country interrupted programming. We have tragic news from Madison, Wisconsin. Singer Otis Redding has died in a plane crash. At Stax Records in Memphis, the phone calls started immediately. Disbelief, denial. Jim Stewart, who'd signed Otis 5 years earlier, reportedly broke down. Steve Cropper, who'd just finished recording with Otis 3 days prior, couldn't process it. The man who'd sat in the studio whistling the end of a song was gone. In Macon, Georgia. Phil Walden received the call. He'd managed Otis since the beginning, built his career, watched him become everything they'd dreamed. He had to tell Zelma, had to tell Otis's wife that her husband wasn't coming home. Zelma Redding was 24 years old with 3 children. Dexter, 5, Carla, 3, Otis the third, just 3 years old. Their father had kissed them goodbye in early December, told them he'd be home for Christmas, promised. The bodies were returned to Georgia over the following days. Funeral arrangements were made. The music industry went into mourning. Aretha Franklin, who'd taken Otis's respect and made it her own, released a statement of grief. Sam Cooke's widow sent condolences, knowing too well the phone call that changes everything. Atlantic Records executives, Stax employees, musicians across every genre, everyone who'd ever heard Otis Redding sing felt the loss. The National Transportation Safety Board conducted its investigation. The official report, filed months later, cited engine failure as the probable cause. Investigators noted the weather conditions, the poor visibility, the ice. They documented every detail of the wreckage, every piece of the plane pulled from Lake Monona. The report answered how the plane crashed. It couldn't answer why it had to be that plane. That day, that lake. Ben Cawley would carry survivor's guilt for decades. In interviews, he'd talk about the cold, about calling their names, about being the only one who came home. He'd rebuild his life, continue playing music. But a part of him stayed in that freezing water, asking the question that has no answer. At Stax Records in Memphis, locked in a vault, sat the multi-track tapes of an unfinished song, a song about sitting still, about watching time pass. Otis Redding would never finish it, but the song wasn't done with the world yet. The funeral was held on December 18th, 1967 at the Big O Ranch in Macon, Georgia. Otis had bought the property with his success, 300 acres where he'd planned to raise his family, to finally rest between tours. Now it would be where they buried him. Over 4,000 people attended. They came from Memphis, from Nashville, from every corner of the South where Otis had performed. Joe Simon sang, Johnny Taylor sang. The Falcons, the group Otis had started with, stood together in grief. Jerry Wexler from Atlantic Records was there, Jim Stewart and Estelle Axton from Stax. Phil Walden, the manager who'd believed in a 21-year-old kid from Macon and never stopped believing. Zelma Redding sat with her children, 3 babies who would grow up with a father they'd barely remember. Dexter, the oldest, would later say he had fragments of memory, a voice, a laugh, a man who picked him up. The younger 2 had almost nothing. The music world struggled to comprehend the loss. In the December 23rd issue of Billboard, the headline read, "Otis Redding dies in crash." The article detailed his career, his impact, his potential. He'd been 26, in the prime of his abilities. Monterey had opened doors to audiences he'd barely begun to reach. Everything was ahead of him. But at Stax Records, there was a decision to make. Steve Cropper returned to the studio days after the funeral. The multi-track tapes of Sittin' on the Dock of the Bay sat exactly where they'd left them, unfinished. Otis's vocal was there, the band was there, the whistle was there, but the mix was incomplete. The song needed work. Cropper later described the weight of that moment in interviews. Finishing the song meant accepting Otis was gone. It meant completing something without the man who'd created it. It also meant potentially releasing Otis Redding's final recording, and that carried responsibility. Cropper didn't take lightly. He brought in engineer Ron Capone. Together, they mixed the track. They added strings, subtle and melancholic. They balanced the levels, made the whistle clearer, polished what Otis had left them. Cropper made choices he thought Otis would have made, or hoped he would have made. There was no way to know for certain. The debate at Stax was real. Should they release it? The song was so different from Otis's other work. It was quiet, reflective. Some worried it wouldn't sell, that it wouldn't honor his legacy properly. Others argued that Otis had believed in the song. He'd wanted it released. His belief should be enough. Jim Stewart made the call. They'd release it. On January 8, 1968, less than a month after Otis Redding's death. Sittin' on the Dock of the Bay was released as a single. The B-side was Sweet Lorene. Another track from those final sessions. Radio stations added it immediately. Not because Stax pushed it, because Otis had just died, and DJs wanted to honor him. They played the song, and then something unexpected happened. People called in, requested it, again and again. The song that Stax executives had worried was too different, too soft, too un-Otis, was connecting with audiences in ways his more explosive hits never had. By March 1968, Sittin' on the Dock of the Bay hit #1 on the Billboard Hot 100, #1 on the R&B charts. It stayed there for weeks. It became Otis Redding's first and only #1 pop hit, the biggest song of his career. The song he never got to hear on the radio. The song he never got to perform live. The song he never got to finish. It was the first posthumous single to hit #1 in the rock era. That fact felt cruel, historic, and cruel. The Dock of the Bay album was released in February 1968, cobbled together from those final recording sessions and earlier unreleased tracks. It went gold, won Grammy nominations. In 1969, the song won 2 Grammys Best R&B Song and Best Male R&B Vocal Performance. Otis's family accepted the awards on his behalf, but questions lingered. Questions that would never have answers. Why had they taken that small plane commercial flights existed between Cleveland and Madison? Cost was likely a factor. Time was likely a factor. Musicians in 1967 flew small planes constantly because it was faster, cheaper, more flexible than commercial airlines. Otis had done it dozens of times without incident. This time, the variables aligned wrong. Weather, mechanical failure, timing, fate. Could the crash have been prevented? The NTSB report suggested better weather assessment might have delayed the flight. Better engine maintenance might have prevented the failure. But hindsight offered no comfort. The crash happened. 6 people died. Ben Cauley lived, and couldn't explain why. What would Otis Redding's career have become? Monterey had proven he could cross over. Dock of the Bay proved he could evolve, could create something beyond the intensity that had defined him. He was 26. Artists twice his age were still growing, still experimenting. He'd barely started. The Bar-Kays reformed with new members, Jimmy King and James Alexander, who hadn't been on the plane, rebuilt the group. They'd continue for decades, honoring the friends they'd lost at Stax Records. The loss was more than personal. It was financial. Otis had been their biggest star, their crossover hope. The label would continue, would produce more hits, but something had broken that couldn't be repaired. And in living rooms across America. People played Sittin' on the Dock of the Bay and heard a man whistling, watching time pass, sitting still. He'd finally stopped moving, just not the way he'd planned. Sittin' on the Dock of the Bay didn't fade after 1968. It became permanent. The song has been covered over 200 times, according to documented recordings. Reggae versions, jazz versions, rock versions, country versions. Artists from every genre tried to capture what Otis had created in that Memphis studio. Michael Bolton covered it, Waylon Jennings covered it, the tragically hip Sarah Bareilles, stick figure generations of musicians returning to that dock, that whistle, that feeling of sitting still while the world moved on. In 1999, the song was inducted into the Grammy Hall of Fame. In 2015, the Library of Congress added it to the National Recording Registry, preserving it as culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant. The song Otis worried might be too different became one of the most important recordings in American music history. Rolling Stone ranked Otis Redding number 21 on their list of the 100 greatest artists of all time. For a career that lasted only 5 years, the impact was staggering. He'd recorded roughly 100 songs, a fraction of what artists with longer careers produced, but those songs carried weight that numbers couldn't measure. Listen to Al Green, and you hear Otis. Listen to modern soul singers like Leon Bridges or Daniel Caesar, and the lineage is clear. The vulnerability, the controlled power, the willingness to let emotion drive the performance rather than technique. Otis didn't just sing, he testified. That approach influenced everyone who came after. In 1989, Otis Redding was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Zelma attended with their children, now grown. Dexter Redding had followed his father into music, so had Otis III. They'd spent their lives learning about the man they barely remembered through his recordings, through stories, through the legacy he'd left behind. The Big O Ranch, where Otis was buried, became a pilgrimage site for fans. People from around the world traveled to Macon, Georgia, to pay respects. The ranch remained in the family, a physical connection to the man whose voice had touched millions. But beyond the accolades and the chart positions and the covers, sitting on the dock of the bay did something more profound. It changed what soul music could be. Before Otis recorded that song, soul was intensity. It was pleading and screaming and testifying. It was church brought to secular stages. Otis had mastered that approach. He'd built his career on it. But Dock of the Bay suggested soul could also be quiet, contemplative, a man sitting with his thoughts, not fighting, not begging, just existing in the moment. That permission echoed through decades. It allowed Marvin Gaye to make What's Going On. It allowed Curtis Mayfield to get introspective. It allowed soul to mature beyond the formula, to become as varied and complex as the people creating it. The tragedy, of course, was that Otis never got to explore that direction further. He'd opened a door and immediately died. The music world was left wondering what else he might have discovered if given time. Aviation safety improved after crashes like Otis's. Regulations tightened. Weather reporting got better. Small aircraft maintenance protocols became more stringent. But musicians still died in plane crashes. Aaliyah in 2001, The Big Bopper, Buddy Holly, and Ritchie Valens in 1959. John Denver in 1997. The risks of constant touring, of small planes, of tight schedules never fully disappeared. The conversation around artist well-being has evolved slowly. In 1967, nobody talked about burnout. Nobody talked about mental health or the cost of relentless touring. You performed until you couldn't. And if you complained, someone else would take your place. Otis was exhausted. The song he wrote was literally about needing to stop. And then the tour schedule demanded he keep moving. Modern artists speak more openly now about saying no, about taking breaks, about prioritizing rest over constant output. The industry hasn't fully changed, but the awareness exists in ways it didn't in Otis's time. Still, the question lingers. What if Otis had said no to that December tour? What if he'd stayed in Memphis, finished the song, taken time with his family? What if weather had grounded the flight? The what-ifs don't bring anyone back. They just sit there, like a man on a dock, watching ships roll away, wasting time. Otis Redding proved that genius and tragedy don't cancel each other out. They coexist. The music remains. The loss remains. Both are true. Both are permanent. The ships keep rolling. The whistle keeps playing. The dock stays empty. December 10th, 1967, Lake Monona, Wisconsin, a Beechcraft H-18 lies 83 feet below the surface, broken and silent, 6 bodies recovered, 1 man pulled out alive, asking why for the rest of his life. Otis Redding is buried at the Big O Ranch in Macon, Georgia, 300 acres he bought to finally have a home, a place to rest between the tours that never seemed to end. He got his rest, just not the kind he'd imagined. The irony writes itself. He recorded a song about sitting still, about wasting time, about watching the world move without him. 3 days later, time ran out. He never heard the song become a hit. Never performed it live, never got to finish what he started. Steve Cropper finished it for him, The world finished it for him. The song became bigger than Otis ever knew. Sittin' on the dock of the bay is played at weddings and funerals, in movies and commercials, on classic soul stations and in coffee shops. The whistle has become one of the most recognizable sounds in popular music. Millions of people know that whistle. Most don't know it exists because Otis Redding couldn't think of lyrics and planned to fix it later. Later never came. There's a cruelty in how fate works. Otis spent 5 years building a career, perfecting his sound, giving everything to audiences night after night. He evolved. He grew. He proved at Monterey that he could reach anyone, anywhere. He wrote a song that suggested a new direction, a quieter maturity. And then a plane went down in fog, and all that potential vanished into freezing water. Zelma raised their children alone. The Barkays rebuilt without their friends. Stax Records continued, but never recovered what it lost that December afternoon. Ben Cauley lived decades carrying the weight of being the only one who survived. And somewhere, on a dock in San Francisco, the ships still roll in. The morning sun still rises. The evening still comes. Otis Redding sang about loneliness and longing better than almost anyone. He sang about love and loss and the weight of being human. His final recording was about a man who'd traveled 2,000 miles and still couldn't find what he was looking for. He's still looking. We're still listening. Rest in peace, Otis Redding.